In this video, we delve into the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, tracing her remarkable journey and the enduring questions surrounding her final flight. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. By 1937, Amelia Earhart stood as a global aviation icon, celebrated for her pioneering achievements that pushed the boundaries of what was possible for women in flight. She had become the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932, following Charles Lindbergh's path just 5 years earlier, and had set numerous speed and altitude records in the years that followed. These feats were not merely personal triumphs, but symbols of progress in an era when aviation itself was still young and fraught with risk. Earhart's public image blended technical skill with quiet determination, making her a household name whose name appeared in newspapers worldwide. That same year, she embarked on what would prove her most ambitious undertaking, an attempt to become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe by air along an equatorial route. The plan called for a 29,000-mile journey in a Lockheed Electra, with stops across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, supported by a navigator and careful logistical planning. It was a venture that demanded precision, endurance, and resources far beyond most contemporary flights, reflecting both the era's growing confidence in long-distance aviation and Earhart's own drive to leave an indelible mark on history. On July 2, 1937, during the most challenging leg of the journey from Lae, New Guinea to Howland Island, Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan vanished over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Established facts confirm that radio contact was lost after a series of increasingly urgent transmissions, and despite one of the largest search operations in naval history involving the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy, no confirmed wreckage or definitive trace of the aircraft was recovered at the time. This absence of physical evidence transformed a tragic aviation incident into the most enduring mystery in the field's history, as the combination of vast ocean distances, limited 1930s tracking technology, and conflicting radio reports left room for interpretation without resolution. What sets Earhart's case apart is the scale of public fascination that has persisted for decades, fueled by her iconic status rather than sensational claims. From the immediate outpouring of global concern in 1937 to ongoing expeditions and scholarly examinations today, her story has inspired countless books, films, and research efforts. Historians note that her disappearance coincided with a period of intense media interest in aviation, amplifying the narrative into a cultural touchstone, while theories such as a crash and sink scenario, a landing on Gardner Island, or even involvement by Japanese forces have circulated. These remain matters of speculation distinguished from verified records. No primary evidence has conclusively supported any single explanation beyond the established fact of her last known position and the unsuccessful search. This blend of documented accomplishment and unresolved questions continues to draw attention, inviting careful consideration of both the historical record and the limits of what can be known from the available evidence. As we move forward, we will examine the path that led Earhart to this moment and the details of her final preparations. To understand how Amelia Earhart became the figure whose disappearance would captivate the world, it is essential to trace the experiences that shaped her character and propelled her into the spotlight long before 1937. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Born in 1897 in Atchison, Kansas, Earhart grew up in an unconventional household that encouraged independence rather than conformity. Her father's struggles with alcohol and the family's frequent moves created an environment of instability. Yet her mother and grandmother instilled in her a sense of self-reliance uncommon for girls of that era. Earhart spent much of her childhood exploring the outdoors, climbing trees and collecting insects, activities that fostered a curiosity about the world beyond traditional domestic roles. These early influences laid the groundwork for her later pursuits. After briefly attending college and working as a nurse's aide during World War I, Earhart encountered aviation almost by chance in 1920 while living in California. Her first airplane ride, a 10-minute flight in a Curtiss JN-4 biplane at an air show, proved transformative. She later described the sensation of leaving the ground as an awakening, declaring that she knew immediately she must learn to fly. Within months, she began lessons with instructor Netta Snook, one of the few women aviators teaching at the time, and purchased her own plane, a second-hand Kinner Airster, despite limited funds. By 1921, she had earned her pilot's license, becoming only the 16th woman to do so. Earhart's decision to pursue flying coincided with a broader cultural moment when aviation captured public imagination. She worked odd jobs to support her training and quickly set her sights on records that would establish her credentials. In 1928, she gained sudden fame not for piloting but as the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air, albeit as a passenger aboard the Friendship. The flight, organized with the help of publisher George Putnam, generated headlines that transformed her into a celebrity. Determined to prove her skills as a pilot, Earhart completed the first solo transatlantic flight by a woman in 1932, departing from Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, and landing in a pasture near Londonderry, Ireland after nearly 15 hours. This achievement, accomplished exactly 5 years after Charles Lindbergh's historic crossing, earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross and cemented her status as an aviation pioneer. Beyond personal records, Earhart actively promoted aviation as a field open to women. She served as vice president of the Luddington Line, an early airline, and helped found the 99s, an organization for female pilots that still exists today. Through lectures, magazine articles, and public appearances, she argued that women possessed the same capacity for technical mastery as men, challenging prevailing assumptions about gender and capability. Her advocacy extended to encouraging girls to study science and mathematics, framing flight not merely as adventure but as a profession with expanding opportunities. In 1931, Earhart married George Putnam, the publicist who had orchestrated much of her early fame. Their partnership blended personal affection with professional strategy. Putnam managed her schedule, negotiated endorsements, and cultivated her image as the approachable yet daring Lady Lindy. Earhart retained her maiden name, a deliberate choice that underscored her independence. Yet the marriage amplified her visibility through books, product lines, and newspaper columns. By the mid-1930s, she had become a household name, her face appearing on magazine covers and her voice heard on radio broadcasts that reached millions. These accomplishments established Earhart as more than a skilled aviator. They positioned her as a symbol of progress at a time when the public eagerly followed feats that expanded the horizons of human endeavor. Her rise from an unconventional Kansas childhood to transatlantic soloist occurred through persistence, calculated risk, and an astute understanding of how media could advance both personal goals and the cause of women in aviation. With that foundation in place, the stage was set for the ambitious undertaking that would define her legacy. In this exploration of Amelia Earhart's disappearance, we trace her final ambitious journey around the world, examining the preparations, setbacks, and relentless challenges that set the stage for her vanishing over the Pacific. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Building directly from the foundation of her pioneering achievements and public stature, Earhart now turned her focus to an undertaking of unprecedented scale. By late 1936, she had secured the financial backing and aircraft necessary for a global circumnavigation, an endeavor she framed. As the journey brought Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan to the remote airfield at Lae in New Guinea, conditions there underscored the mounting pressures of the world flight. The strip was short, unpaved in places, and offered minimal maintenance facilities for a heavily modified aircraft, while local weather patterns threatened to close in within days. These factors, combined with the need to stay on schedule for the critical Howland Island leg, compelled a rush departure on the morning of July 2, 1937, despite the Electra's extreme takeoff weight and the limited runway length. In this exploration of Amelia Earhart's disappearance, we trace her final ambitious journey around the world, examining the preparations, setbacks, and relentless challenges that set the stage for her vanishing over the Pacific. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. The Lockheed Electra 10E had undergone extensive modifications for long-range flight, including the installation of additional fuel tanks that brought total capacity to roughly 1,150 U.S. gallons. Fully loaded, the aircraft weighed more than 15,000 pounds, leaving little margin for error on takeoff from Lay's 3,000-foot runway. Earhart and Noonan had already lightened the load by removing non-essential equipment, yet the fuel requirement for the 556-mile leg to Howland remained non-negotiable. Fred Noonan's role proved indispensable. A former Pan American Airways navigator with thousands of hours charting Pacific routes, Noonan possessed the celestial navigation skills required to locate the tiny target of Howland, an island barely a mile long and visible only in clear conditions. His expertise allowed the crew to plan precise dead reckoning segments between radio fixes, though the absence of reliable ground stations beyond Leh placed the burden squarely on his calculations. Weather forecasts received at Leh indicated generally favorable winds and visibility for the initial portion of the flight, with expectations that the Electra could reach Howland in approximately 18 hours under normal cruise settings. U.S. Coast Guard reports and local observations supported this outlook, yet they also noted the narrow window before a front might move into the area. Earhart and Noonan therefore elected to proceed rather than risk further delays. Witnesses on the ground, including Australian officials and airfield personnel, observed the Electra lumber down the runway, barely clearing the treetops at the end before settling into a climb. Last confirmed communications from Leh recorded the aircraft's departure time at 10 a.m. Local and noted routine position reports during the first few hours, establishing that the plane was airborne, on course, and carrying its maximum fuel load. These documented facts mark the final verified moments before the flight entered the vast Central Pacific. In this exploration of Amelia Earhart's disappearance, we trace her final ambitious journey around the world, examining the preparations, setbacks, and relentless challenges that set the stage for her vanishing over the Pacific. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. With the Lockheed Electra airborne from Leh at 10 a.m. local time on July 2, 1937, Earhart and Noonan turned southeast across the Solomon Sea toward the Central Pacific. Their intended route to Howland Island covered 2,556 statute miles of open ocean, a distance that demanded precise dead reckoning navigation supplemented by celestial fixes. Howland itself presented extreme challenges. A narrow coral atoll barely 1 mile long and half a mile wide, lacking any prominent landmarks and requiring exact arrival within a narrow time window for visual acquisition. Throughout the first 12 hours, the crew maintained scheduled position reports via the aircraft's high-frequency radio. At approximately 2:45 p.m. Leh time, they transmitted a routine message confirming their course and estimated ground speed. Additional contacts with Leh and later with Nauru Island relayed fuel consumption figures and wind observations, all consistent with the planned 18 to 19-hour flight duration under normal cruise power. These early transmissions, logged by multiple ground stations, established that the Electra was on its intended track and operating normally. As the flight progressed into the night, Noonan relied on star sightings to correct for any drift. Weather reports indicated generally favorable conditions, yet the crew encountered scattered cloud layers that occasionally obscured celestial references. By dawn on July 2nd, Greenwich Mean Time, the Electra had crossed the international dateline and approached the final leg. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca, stationed off Howland to provide radio homing, began receiving increasingly frequent calls from Earhart as the aircraft neared the search radius. Visibility over Howland proved critical and problematic. The island's low profile meant it could be sighted only in clear air from a distance of roughly 20 miles under ideal conditions. Sunrise glare from the east further complicated matters as the sun rose directly behind the intended approach path, reducing contrast against the sea surface. Radio logs from Itasca document Earhart's 6:14 a.m. transmission requesting a bearing, followed by a 6:45 a.m. report that the plane was 200 miles out and expecting arrival in roughly 1 hour. These times reflect the ship's local zone and have been cross-verified against multiple archival copies, though minor discrepancies of a few minutes appear in some secondary accounts due to clock synchronization differences. With the Lockheed Electra airborne from Leh at 10 a.m. local time on July 2, 1937, Earhart and Noonan turned southeast across the Solomon Sea toward the Central Pacific. Their intended route to Howland Island covered 2,556 statute miles of open ocean, a distance that demanded precise dead reckoning navigation supplemented by celestial fixes. Howland itself presented extreme challenges. A narrow coral atoll barely 1 mile long and half a mile wide, lacking any prominent landmarks and requiring exact arrival within a narrow time window for visual acquisition. Throughout the first 12 hours, the crew maintained scheduled position reports via the aircraft's high-frequency radio. At approximately 2:45 p.m. Leh time, they transmitted a routine message confirming their course and estimated ground speed. Additional contacts with Leh and later with Nauru Island relayed fuel consumption figures and wind observations, all consistent with the planned 18 to 19-hour flight duration under normal cruise power. These early transmissions, logged by multiple ground stations, established that the Electra was on its intended track and operating normally. As the flight progressed into the night, Noonan relied on star sightings to correct for any drift. Weather reports indicated generally favorable conditions, yet the crew encountered scattered cloud layers that occasionally obscured celestial references. By dawn on July 2nd, Greenwich Mean Time, the Electra had crossed the international dateline and approached the final leg. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca, stationed off Howland to provide radio homing, began receiving increasingly frequent calls from Earhart as the aircraft neared the search radius. Visibility over Howland proved critical and problematic. The island's low profile meant it could be sighted only in clear air from a distance of roughly 20 miles under ideal conditions. Sunrise glare from the east further complicated matters as the sun rose directly behind the intended approach path, reducing contrast against the sea surface. Radio logs from Itasca document Earhart's 6:14 a.m. transmission requesting a bearing, followed by a 6:45 a.m. report that the plane was 200 miles out and expecting arrival in roughly 1 hour. These times reflect the ship's local zone and have been cross-verified against multiple archival copies, though minor discrepancies of a few minutes appear in some secondary accounts due to clock synchronization differences. President Franklin the 500th. Roosevelt, informed of the situation through naval channels on the afternoon of July 2nd, authorized the deployment of massive naval resources the following day. This decision reflected both the national significance of Earhart's flight and the strategic value of testing long-range search and rescue capabilities in the Central Pacific. Roosevelt personally directed the Navy Department to commit whatever assets were required, resulting in one of the largest peacetime search operations in U.S. naval history up to that point. The authorization bypassed standard budgetary reviews, underscoring the urgency placed on locating the aviator and her navigator Fred Noonan. The aircraft carrier USS Lexington, under Captain Jonathan S. Dowell, was ordered from its position near California to proceed at flank speed toward the search area, accompanied by the heavy cruiser USS Saratoga's air group elements and supported by destroyers such as USS Drayton, USS Lamson, and USS Preston. The Lexington arrived on station by July 6th. The carrier launched 24 aircraft in coordinated daily sorties, covering a search grid that ultimately encompassed more than 250,000 square miles of ocean. Navy planners selected this expansive area by calculating probable drift rates from surface currents, estimated fuel endurance from Earhart's last reported position, and the possibility that the Electra had turned northwest or southeast after missing Howland. Search patterns followed rectangular creeping line tracks at low altitude to maximize visual detection. with each plane assigned overlapping sectors to reduce gaps. The operation continued for 14 days until July 18th, when fuel and operational limits forced withdrawal despite no wreckage or survivors being sighted. The scale of the effort involved over 3,000 personnel across multiple vessels, with the Lexington alone consuming more than 100,000 gallons of fuel during the deployment. Primary source documents, including the Navy's official after-action summary, note that search crews maintained visual watches from dawn to dusk, supplemented by radio direction finding equipment tuned to the Electra's known frequencies. Despite these measures, the search yielded only scattered debris unrelated to the aircraft, such as floating logs and fishing floats. The reasoning behind the chosen coverage area centered on the 157-337 line transmitted by Earhart, combined with prevailing easterly trade winds that would have pushed any ditched aircraft westward. However, planners also allocated limited sorties farther afield to account for navigation errors of up to 100 miles. During the broader Pacific monitoring that accompanied the official search, several radio signals were reported on frequencies associated with the Electra, including intermittent distress calls heard by operators on the island of Nauru and by amateur listeners in the United States. Some of these signals were later linked in contemporary accounts to the vicinity of Gardner Island, now known as Nikumaroro, located roughly 350 miles southeast of Howland. The signals, described as weak voice transmissions or Morse code fragments, prompted brief discussion among search coordinators but did not alter the primary grid around Howland, because they could not be triangulated with sufficient precision and were deemed possibly spurious or from other vessels. This aspect of the radio traffic has remained a point of historical controversy, as the official Navy search never diverted significant resources to Gardner, yet the reported bearings align with later private expeditions that found circumstantial artifacts on the island. Established naval records confirm that all verified transmissions ceased after July 2nd, leaving any Gardner-related signals in the realm of unconfirmed reports rather than proven contact. The official search concluded without locating Earhart or Noonan, having exhausted the practical limits of 1937 aviation and maritime technology over an area larger than the continental United States. These documented operations, detailed in declassified Navy and Coast Guard archives, represent the factual baseline against which all subsequent theories must be measured. In this section of our continuing documentary exploration into the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, we turn to the critical question of why one of the largest peacetime search operations in U.S. naval history ultimately came up empty. Drawing on official logs, after-action reports, and contemporary accounts, we analyze the systemic failures and environmental challenges that sealed the outcome. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Building directly from the extensive efforts we examined in the previous section, where the USS Lexington and supporting vessels scoured more than 250,000 square miles without result, the reasons for failure reveal a convergence of technological constraints, navigational uncertainties, and operational realities that no amount of presidential authorization could overcome. The search was not a failure of will, but a stark illustration of 1937 limitations confronting the immensity of the Pacific. The vast search area itself represented the first insurmountable barrier. Howland Island, Earhart's intended destination, sat as a speck in an ocean expanse larger than the continental United States. Naval planners calculated probable positions based on her final reported line of position, the 157-337 degree bearing transmitted at 8:43 a.m. Itasca time. But this datum encompassed hundreds of thousands of square miles once fuel exhaustion, wind drift, and possible course corrections were factored in. In an era before satellite imagery or long-range radar, searchers relied exclusively on visual sweeps from aircraft flying at low altitude and surface vessels limited to roughly 15 knots. The Lexington's air group flew rectangular creeping line patterns from dawn to dusk, yet each sortie covered only narrow corridors, leaving gaps that ocean currents could widen within hours. Contemporary Navy estimates placed the effective daily coverage at under 20,000 square miles under ideal conditions, a fraction of the required grid. Compounding this was the total absence of wreckage markers. Without modern debris field modeling or underwater sonar, floating evidence could drift hundreds of miles before detection became possible. Technology of the period further crippled precision. Radio direction finding equipment aboard the Itasca and Lexington proved unreliable at the distances involved. Earhart's transmissions on 3,105 kilocycles were often weak and intermittent, and the ship's high-frequency direction finder lacked calibration for her voice-modulated signals. Operators reported bearings that fluctuated wildly, sometimes by as much as 30 degrees, rendering triangulation impossible. Miscommunications compounded the issue. Earhart's final messages indicated she was flying at 1,000 feet on a north-south line, yet the Itasca's repeated requests for her to switch to 500 kilocycles for better homing went unanswered or were misunderstood amid static. Primary source entries in the cutter's radio log document at least 4 instances of garbled exchanges between 7:42 and 8:43 a.m., including Earhart's frustrated reply that she could not hear the Itasca clearly. These errors stemmed not from negligence, but from the rudimentary state of airborne and shipboard radio in 1937, where crystal-controlled sets and manual loop antennas offered only crude accuracy beyond line-of-sight ranges. Questions surrounding the plane's actual position at the moment of last contact introduced additional layers of uncertainty that the search planners could never resolve. Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan had relied on celestial navigation and dead reckoning across 2,556 miles from Le New Guinea, yet Noonan's chronometer logs, if they survived, were never recovered. The Lockheed Electra's fuel capacity calculations assumed a precise arrival over Howland, but prevailing headwinds and possible navigational drift of 50 to 100 miles placed the aircraft anywhere along an arc stretching northwest toward the Gilbert Islands or southeast toward the Phoenix Group. Official Coast Guard analyses later noted that the assumed fuel exhaustion point shifted by nearly 200 miles depending on whether Earhart maintained her reported 157-degree course or executed an unrecorded turn. Without wreckage or survivor testimony, search coordinators were forced to allocate limited sorties across multiple hypotheses, diluting coverage in any single sector. Established naval records confirm that while the primary grid centered on Howland, secondary patrols extended only as resources allowed, leaving plausible alternative crash sites unexamined. Budgetary pressures and logistical exhaustion ultimately dictated the abrupt termination of operations. Although President Roosevelt had authorized unlimited assets, the Lexington alone burned more than 100,000 gallons of fuel during its 14-day deployment, a figure that represented a significant fraction of available Pacific Fleet reserves in 1937. Destroyers such as the Drayton and Lamson required constant replenishment from oilers that were themselves stretched thin. Navy Department after-action summaries explicitly cite fuel depletion, crew fatigue, and the onset of the typhoon season as decisive factors in the July 18th withdrawal order. No further appropriations were sought once the probability of locating survivors dropped below operational thresholds. This decision reflected cold arithmetic rather than diminished national interest. Each additional day yielded diminishing returns against an ever-expanding search radius driven by unknown drift rates. Official conclusions followed swiftly from these constraints. On July 19, 1937, the Navy declared Earhart and Noonan lost at sea, a finding formalized in Coast Guard reports submitted that month. Amelia Earhart was declared legally dead on January 5, 1939, after the standard 7-year presumption period under U.S. law, though the family accepted the determination earlier based on the exhaustive but fruitless efforts. These pronouncements rested squarely on documented evidence, no verified radio signals after July 2nd, no visual sightings, and exhaustive coverage of the most probable zones. Speculation about alternative outcomes, while persistent in later decades, remains outside the verified record established by the contemporary search. Taken together, these factors illustrate systemic failures rooted in the era's technological ceiling and the inherent unpredictability of open ocean aviation distress. The search succeeded in demonstrating unprecedented national commitment, yet could not surmount the Pacific's scale or the Electra's final unknowable position. This factual foundation now guides our examination of the leading theories that have emerged in the decades since. In this section of our documentary on the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, we examine the crash and sink theory, the explanation long endorsed by U.S. government investigators as the most probable outcome of her final flight. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Building directly from the exhaustive but unsuccessful naval operations detailed earlier, this theory rests on the documented record of fuel limits, radio transmissions, and the unforgiving geography of the Central Pacific. On July 19, 1937, the Navy formally concluded that Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan were lost at sea, a determination grounded in the absence of any verified signals after 8:43 a.m. Itasca time on July 2nd, combined with precise calculations of the Lockheed Electra's fuel state. Coast Guard and Navy after-action reports from that month emphasized that the aircraft, after covering roughly 2,556 miles from Lae, New Guinea, had reached or passed the point of exhaustion while searching for the tiny target of Howland Island. This official stance has remained the baseline position of the United States government, reflected in subsequent reviews by the National Transportation Safety Board and the Earhart disappearance files archived at the National Archives. While alternative hypotheses have circulated for decades, the crash and sink scenario aligns most closely with the primary evidence available in 1937 and the physical constraints of open ocean aviation at the time. The reasoning behind this conclusion begins with the Electra's known fuel capacity and consumption rates. The Model 10E carried approximately 1,150 gallons of gasoline in standard configuration, augmented by additional tanks for the world flight, yielding an estimated endurance of 20 to 22 hours under cruise conditions at 1,000 to 1,500 feet altitude. Earhart's last confirmed transmission at 8:43 a.m. indicated she was on a north-south line of position, 157, 337 degrees, and running low on fuel. Flight logs and post-flight analyses by Lockheed engineers and Purdue University technicians who had prepared the aircraft calculated that, accounting for headwinds encountered across the 18-hour leg from Lae, the plane would have had no more than 30 to 60 minutes of usable fuel remaining at that moment. Any deviation from the planned course or additional circling to locate Howland would have accelerated depletion. Official Navy summaries explicitly note that Earhart's radio messages showed progressive urgency about fuel, culminating in her statement that she was running north and south on the line of position. Absent any further contact, investigators concluded the most parsimonious explanation was ditching or uncontrolled descent into the sea once the engine stopped. This assessment drew on contemporaneous meteorological data from the Itasca, confirming moderate headwinds that matched the fuel burn projections rather than any anomalous mechanical failure. Ocean depth and surface conditions near Howland Island reinforced the likelihood that any wreckage would have vanished rapidly and permanently. Howland lies on the edge of the equatorial Pacific, where bathymetric charts compiled by the U.S. Navy Hydrographic Office in the 1930s already indicated depths exceeding 16,000 feet within 50 miles of the island. The seafloor in this region consists of abyssal plains punctuated by occasional seamounts, with strong equatorial currents and frequent trade wind swells that would have dispersed floating debris within hours. Earhart's final messages mentioned flying at 1,000 feet, an altitude from which a fuel-exhausted glide or controlled ditching would still place the aircraft many miles from the island's fringing reef. Once submerged, the Lockheed Electra's aluminum structure, lacking the pressurization or redundant buoyancy features of later designs, would have flooded quickly and descended to depths where pressure exceeds 7,000 pounds per square inch. No flotation equipment or life raft was carried on this leg, consistent with the weight-saving measures Earhart had adopted for the long overwater segments. These environmental factors explain why surface searchers aboard the Itasca and later the Lexington found no oil slicks, no floating wreckage, and no dye markers. None had been deployed because the flight plan assumed a land arrival. Analysis of fuel exhaustion scenarios further narrows the probable crash site to a corridor southeast or northwest of Howland, depending on the exact moment of engine failure. Contemporary calculations performed by the Coast Guard's radio and navigation staff, preserved in the Itasca's deck logs, modeled three primary possibilities: an on-course arrival with immediate ditching upon fuel starvation, a continuing search pattern that extended range by 50 to 80 miles, or a navigational error placing the aircraft 100 miles or more off the intended track. Each scenario produced a fuel zero point within a 200-mile arc centered on Howland. The 157, 337-degree line of position reported at 8:43 a.m. intersected this arc at right angles, meaning the aircraft could have been anywhere along that line when the tanks ran dry. Primary source entries in the Navy's 1937 search planning documents record that planners allocated the majority of air and surface assets to the most probable segment of that line, the 50-mile radius around Howland, yet still acknowledged that a 30-minute fuel margin error or a 10-degree heading deviation could shift the ditching point beyond visual range. These mathematical reconstructions, while necessarily probabilistic, remain the only data-driven framework available. No physical evidence has contradicted them. The challenges of underwater archaeology in this region compound the difficulty of ever locating definitive proof. Even today, the combination of extreme depth, perpetual darkness below 1,000 feet, and sediment layers that accumulate at rates of several centimeters per year renders systematic survey extraordinarily expensive and technically demanding. The 1937 search operated without sonar, without bathymetric mapping beyond crude lid-line soundings, and without any capacity to recover objects from abyssal depths. Modern expeditions face the same fundamental barrier. The search area, once expanded to account for drift and possible course variations, encompasses thousands of square miles of terrain that would require dozens of autonomous underwater vehicle deployments at costs exceeding several $1,000,000 per week. Side-scan sonar images can detect large metallic objects, yet distinguishing an electricized airframe from volcanic basalt outcrops or shipwrecks from later eras demands multiple passes and, ultimately, visual confirmation by remotely operated vehicles. Currents at depth, though slower than surface flows, still transport fine sediment that can bury artifacts within decades. These limitations are not speculative. They are documented in the operational reports of every organized underwater search conducted since the 1980s. Recent sonar surveys illustrate both the promise and the persistent gaps in the crash and sink hypothesis. Between 2001 and 2017, expeditions sponsored by the Earhart Project and later by Nauticos LLC deployed towed and autonomous sonar arrays across high-probability zones derived from refined fuel and drift models. One 2017 mission, operating from the research vessel E/V Nautilus, covered approximately 100 square miles southeast of Howland at depths between 14,000 and 16,000 feet. The survey returned several acoustic anomalies consistent in size and shape with a twin-engine aircraft, yet subsequent camera inspections revealed only natural geological features. Earlier efforts in the 2000s similarly identified linear sonar returns that, upon closer examination, proved to be basalt ridges or scattered metallic debris unrelated to 1937 aviation. No expedition has yet produced a confirmed fragment of the Lockheed Electra or any artifact bearing Earhart's registration number NR16020. The absence of such finds does not disprove the theory. Rather, it underscores the mismatch between the vastness of the probable crash zone and the narrow corridors that can be examined with current technology. Official U.S. government statements continue to cite these searches as consistent with a deep water loss, while noting that conclusive proof would require resources far beyond those allocated to date. Taken together, the crash and sink theory offers a coherent narrative anchored in fuel mathematics, radio logs, and the documented oceanographic conditions around Howland. It accounts for the complete lack of post-loss radio signals, the failure of the largest peacetime naval search in American history, and the physical reality that any ditching in these waters would leave minimal trace on the surface. At the same time, the theory carries inherent limitations. The precise location of any wreckage remains unknown, and the possibility of an undiscovered shallow water site or an unrecorded course change cannot be entirely excluded on present evidence. Primary documents from 1937 contain no eyewitness sightings of a crash, no recovered personal effects, and no mechanical telemetry that would allow investigators to pinpoint the final moments. Consequently, while the crash and sink explanation stands as the position supported by the greatest weight of verifiable contemporary records, it leaves open the question of whether future deep ocean technology might one day locate the Electra and convert probability into certainty. This foundation of established fact and acknowledged uncertainty now directs our attention to the next major hypothesis that has shaped public understanding of Earhart's fate. In this section of our documentary on the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, we turn our attention to the Gardner Island hypothesis, an alternative explanation that has drawn sustained attention from researchers and the public alike. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Building directly from the documented constraints of the crash and sink scenario, this theory proposes that Earhart and Noonan may have reached the remote atoll then known as Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro, roughly 350 miles southeast of Howland. The hypothesis originated in archival research conducted during the 1980s by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, commonly referred to as THR. Founded by aviation historian Richard Gillespie, THR began examining British colonial records from the 1930s and 1940s that described signs of recent human presence on the uninhabited island shortly after Earhart's disappearance. These records, preserved in the Western Pacific High Commission archives, noted that a British survey party in October 1937 found evidence of campfires, a shoe, and what appeared to be aircraft parts on the island's northern shore. THEAR's subsequent expeditions, beginning with a 1989 reconnaissance and continuing through multiple visits into the 2010s, have framed the Nikumaroro theory as a testable alternative grounded in both historical documents and physical evidence recovered from the atoll. Central to the hypothesis is the possibility that Earhart, unable to locate Howland, turned southeast along her reported line of position and located the coral reef surrounding Gardner Island. Proponents note that the island's prominent lagoon and wide reef flat would have offered a visible target from several thousand feet, especially under the clear conditions reported by the Itasca on the morning of July 2, 1937. Once on the reef, the Electra might have remained intact long enough for the aviators to survive for days or weeks while transmitting distress calls. This scenario draws on verified post-loss radio signals logged by amateur operators and Pan American Airways stations across the Pacific between July 2nd and July 6th. Several of these intercepts described a woman's voice repeating phrases consistent with Earhart's known radio procedures, including references to ship or plane and requests for position fixes. While many signals were dismissed at the time as hoaxes or atmospheric interference, TIHAR has cross-referenced the timing and content of the more credible reports with propagation models, arguing that transmissions from a grounded aircraft on Nikumaroro's reef would have been plausible during daylight hours when the reef surface was exposed at low tide. Physical artifacts recovered during TIH expeditions constitute the most tangible body of evidence advanced in support of the theory. On the island's southeastern shore, searchers located fragments of aluminum skin, a plexiglass window section, and a zipper pull from a woman's shoe manufactured in the 1930s. Additional finds include a glass bottle bearing the remnants of a freckle cream label matching a product Earhart was known to have used, and a small piece of leather identified by forensic examiners as consistent with an aviator's flight jacket. These items were documented in situ, photographed, and subjected to laboratory analysis by independent metallurgists and textile specialists. Nevertheless, critics have contested their identification, pointing out that the aluminum fragments lack the specific rivet patterns or registration markings of the Lockheed Electra and could derive from later World War II-era overflights or even colonial-era debris. The shoe components, while stylistically appropriate to the period, have been matched by some forensic analysts to footwear issued to British colonial personnel rather than to Earhart's personal effects. TIHAR maintains that the cumulative context of multiple artifacts in a single concentrated area strengthens the association, yet acknowledges that none carries an unambiguous link to NR 16020, the 1940 discovery of a partial human skeleton on Gardner Island forms another cornerstone of the hypothesis and illustrates the challenges of distinguishing established fact from later interpretation. British colonial administrator Gerald Gallagher reported finding the remains near a large tree on the island's northern end, accompanied by a woman's shoe, a sextant box, and a Benedictine liqueur bottle. The bones were measured on site, shipped to Fiji for examination by a medical officer who concluded they belonged to a stocky European male approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, and were subsequently lost during World War II. TIY researchers later obtained the original measurement data and commissioned forensic anthropologists to reanalyze them using modern statistical methods. The re-examination, published in peer-reviewed journals, concluded that the skeletal proportions fell within the range of possibility for a female of Earhart's documented height and build. DNA testing has not been possible because the remains have never been recovered, leaving the identification dependent on circumstantial measurements and associated artifacts. Skeptics, including forensic anthropologists unaffiliated with TCARE, have noted that the original measurements were taken under field conditions without complete long bones, and that the statistical overlap with male skeletons of similar stature prevents definitive attribution. The case therefore remains an example of compelling but ultimately inconclusive evidence. The radio signals reported after July 2nd provide an additional line of inquiry into the possibility of a survival period on the island. Contemporary logs from the Coast Guard cutter Itasca, the battleship Colorado, and civilian listening posts record more than 30 alleged distress transmissions between July 2nd and July 6th. Several described a voice stating, "Earhart calling," or requesting bearings on 3,105 kilocycles, the frequency Earhart had used earlier. Direction-finding bearings taken by operators in Hawaii and on ships at sea placed some of these signals in the general vicinity of the Phoenix Islands group, which includes Nikumaroro. Official Navy summaries at the time discounted most of these reports because they lacked the authentication code Earhart had been instructed to use, yet later analysis by radio historians has shown that atmospheric conditions and equipment limitations could have prevented proper authentication. TIJR argues that the pattern of daytime-only signals aligns with the tidal exposure of the reef flat, where the aircraft's generator could have been operated while the engines were inoperative. Critics counter that the absence of any verified Morse code identifier or specific geographic reference in the transmissions renders them unreliable as primary evidence, noting that similar unexplained signals were logged during other aviation incidents of the era, without corresponding wreckage. These accounts, which gained traction after World War II, propose that Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan did not simply vanish over open ocean or reach an uninhabited atoll, but instead landed in territory under Japanese control, where they were detained, interrogated, or executed. While such narratives have circulated for decades in books, documentaries, and eyewitness recollections, they rest almost entirely on secondhand testimony, wartime rumors, and later interpretations of declassified records rather than on contemporaneous documents from 1937 itself. We will therefore distinguish carefully between verifiable archival material and the layers of speculation that have accumulated around this hypothesis. The origins of the Japanese capture theory can be traced to scattered reports that surfaced during the Pacific War and immediately afterward. American servicemen stationed on islands formerly held by Japan encountered local residents who claimed to have seen a white woman aviator in custody in the late 1930s. These stories were amplified in post-war publications, most notably in 1949 when journalist Fred Gardner began investigating claims that Earhart had been held on Saipan. Gardner's subsequent book, The Search for Amelia Earhart, published in 1966, popularized the notion that the aviator had been mistaken for a spy, imprisoned, and ultimately killed by Japanese authorities. Although Gardner presented numerous interviews, later researchers noted that many of his sources provided contradictory dates and details, and no Japanese military records from 1937 independently corroborate the presence of an American aircraft or its crew in the mandated islands at that time. Central to the capture hypothesis is the suggestion that Earhart may have landed in the Marshall Islands rather than continuing toward Howland. Proponents argue that navigational error, combined with the Electra's limited fuel reserves, could have placed the aircraft near Mili Atoll or Jaluit Atoll, both under Japanese administration as part of the South Seas Mandate. Some versions of the theory claim that Japanese fishing vessels or patrol boats towed the damaged Electra to a harbor where Earhart and Noonan were taken into custody. A 1970s account attributed to a Marshallese witness named Bilimon Amaron described seeing a twin-engine aircraft on a barge near Jaluit and two Caucasian captives, one of whom matched Earhart's description. While such testimony has been repeated in several documentaries, it was recorded more than 3 decades after the events and lacks corroboration from Japanese harbor logs or contemporaneous radio traffic. Official Japanese records examined after the war contain no references to the recovery of an American Lockheed Electra in 1937, a point consistently emphasized in U.S. government reviews of the case. Evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of the Gardner Island hypothesis requires separating verifiable historical records from interpretive speculation. On the positive side, the theory accounts for the lack of immediate wreckage near Howland, incorporates documented post-loss radio activity, and draws upon multiple categories of physical evidence recovered under controlled archaeological conditions. The British colonial records from 1937 constitute primary source documentation of possible recent habitation, and the forensic reanalysis of the 1940 skeleton measurements represents a legitimate application of updated scientific techniques to incomplete data. The hypothesis also offers a coherent explanation for why Earhart might have deviated from her intended track. The 157-337-degree line of position she reported intersects the Phoenix Islands chain, making Nikumaroro a plausible alternate landfall within the Electra's remaining fuel range. At the same time, the theory faces significant limitations that other researchers have emphasized. No artifact recovered to date bears Earhart's aircraft registration number or any other unique identifier that would place the Lockheed Electra definitively on the island. The contested identification of the aluminum fragments and personal items leaves open the possibility that they originated from the island's later settlement period beginning in 1938, or from wartime activity. The skeleton's loss prevents direct genetic confirmation, and the original 1940 medical assessment, while later reinterpreted, was performed by a trained physician whose conclusions cannot be dismissed without additional evidence. Radio signal analysis remains inherently probabilistic. Propagation studies can demonstrate possibility but not certainty that any given transmission originated from Nikumaroro rather than from drifting life rafts or distant stations. Government archives continue to reflect the position that the weight of 1937 evidence supports a loss at sea near Howland, while noting that the Nikumaroro hypothesis, though intriguing, has not produced conclusive proof after more than 3 decades of investigation. Taken together, the Gardner Island theory illustrates both the enduring appeal of alternative explanations and the rigorous standards required to move speculation into established fact. Its proponents have assembled an interdisciplinary body of archival, archaeological, and forensic material that invites ongoing scrutiny, yet the absence of a single definitive artifact or document means the hypothesis remains one of several plausible narratives rather than a settled conclusion. This measured assessment of supporting evidence and acknowledged gaps now leads us to examine additional theories that have circulated since 1937. Continuing our examination of the competing explanations for Amelia Earhart's 1937 disappearance, we now turn to the capture theories that allege Japanese military involvement. In this section of our documentary on the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, we explore the capture theories and Japanese involvement. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Claims of subsequent sightings, imprisonment, or execution form the emotional core of the capture narrative, yet remain difficult to substantiate. Multiple individuals, primarily on Saipan, have stated over the years that they observed a woman resembling Earhart, either in a prison cell at a local airfield or being transported under guard. One frequently cited account comes from a Saipan resident named Josephine Blanco, who in the 1960s recalled seeing a white woman and man near an aircraft hangar in 1937 when she was a teenager. Other witnesses described hearing of an execution or of unmarked graves on the island. These stories gained additional circulation through the 1980s and 1990s as researchers such as Vincent Loomis and later Mike Campbell collected further oral histories. However, forensic and archival examinations have repeatedly found that the timelines provided by witnesses often conflict with one another and with the known movements of Japanese military units in the pre-war period. Moreover, the absence of any authenticated photographs, personal effects, or burial records traceable to Earhart or Noonan leaves these accounts in the realm of anecdotal evidence rather than documented fact. The Saipan connection has proven especially durable within popular accounts of the disappearance. Advocates point to alleged witness testimony that Earhart was held at Garapan prison or executed near the island's airfield. Some versions include claims that Japanese authorities suspected her of conducting photographic reconnaissance over fortified islands in violation of the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty restrictions. A 1967 expedition sponsored by CBS News and led by Gardner excavated several sites on Saipan but recovered no remains or artifacts that could be linked to the aviators. Subsequent Japanese and American investigations, including reviews of captured Imperial Japanese Navy documents after 1945, found no internal memoranda or personnel files mentioning the detention of an American woman pilot in 1937. The U.S. Defense POW/MEA accounting agency and its predecessors have examined these claims on multiple occasions and concluded that the weight of evidence does not support the presence of Earhart or Noonan on Saipan. Declassified American and Japanese documents provide the most reliable lens through which to evaluate the capture hypothesis, and they have consistently produced official denials rather than confirmation. In 1970, the U.S. Navy released a summary of its 1937 search records, which contained no intelligence suggesting a Japanese interception. Further releases under the Freedom of Information Act in the 1990s and early 2000s included State Department cables and Office of Naval Intelligence reports that addressed post-war rumors yet found them unsubstantiated. A 1994 review by the U.S. Department of the Interior's Office of Territorial and International Affairs examined Marshallese and Saipanese oral histories alongside Japanese colonial archives and reached the same conclusion. No primary source documentation from 1937 places Earhart or Noonan in Japanese custody. Japanese government statements, including those issued through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in response to inquiries in the 1980s and 1990s, have likewise maintained that no records exist of any such incident. While some theorists interpret the absence of records as evidence of a deliberate cover-up, historians note that Japanese military administration of the Mandate Islands was extensively documented in other respects, and the sudden appearance of an American aircraft would have generated considerable internal correspondence. It is important to acknowledge that a small number of declassified files do contain intriguing but inconclusive references that have kept speculation alive. For example, a 1944 Office of Strategic Services memorandum summarized hearsay from Filipino informants about an American woman flyer reportedly executed on Saipan. Yet the memo itself labeled the information as unverified rumor. Similarly, a handful of post-war affidavits collected by the Army's Graves Registration Service mention local stories of a white woman's grave, but none included physical evidence or chain of custody documentation that would allow modern forensic identification. These documents illustrate how wartime intelligence gathering sometimes preserved unconfirmed leads, yet they fall short of constituting proof that Earhart reached Japanese territory. Evaluating the capture theories therefore requires separating the understandable human desire for a definitive explanation from the available historical record. The hypothesis accounts for the lack of recovered wreckage near Howland and offers a dramatic narrative consistent with the geopolitical tensions of the late 1930s. It also draws on the real phenomenon of post-war oral histories that emerged across the Pacific as island communities processed the upheavals of Japanese and subsequent American occupations. At the same time, the theory's reliance on retrospective testimony collected decades later, the absence of any Japanese documentary trail, and the repeated failure of physical searches to produce conclusive artifacts place it in the category of persistent speculation rather than established fact. Government archives on both sides of the Pacific continue to reflect the position that Earhart's flight ended in the vicinity of Howland Island, either through fuel exhaustion or navigational error, without Japanese intervention. Taken together, the capture theories demonstrate how the mystery of Amelia Earhart's disappearance has intersected with broader themes of wartime memory, national secrecy, and the challenges of verifying oral history across cultural and linguistic divides. While no single piece of evidence has elevated these accounts beyond the level of compelling anecdote, their endurance underscores the public's ongoing fascination with an aviator whose fate remains unresolved. This examination of the Japanese capture hypothesis now leads us to consider the broader legacy that Earhart's final flight has left on aviation safety, international search and rescue protocols, and the evolving role of women in exploration. As we conclude our exploration of Amelia Earhart's 1937 disappearance, this section examines the lasting legacy she left behind and the lessons her story continues to teach us about risk, exploration, and the pursuit of answers. In this section of our documentary on the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, we explore her enduring influence and the broader implications of her final flight. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. Amelia Earhart's influence on aviation and women's history stands as one of the most verifiable elements of her story. Before her final flight, she had already established records that reshaped perceptions of what women could achieve in a male-dominated field. Her 1932 solo transatlantic crossing, completed in just under 15 hours, earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross from the United States Congress, a distinction previously awarded only to men. Contemporary accounts in the New York Times and aviation journals of the era document how her achievements inspired thousands of women to pursue flight training. Primary correspondence preserved in the Schlesinger Library at Harvard shows Earhart actively mentoring younger female pilots through the 99s organization she helped found in 1929. These documented accomplishments remain separate from the unresolved questions surrounding her disappearance and continue to serve as established milestones in aviation history. The mystery itself produced measurable changes in search and rescue protocols. The 1937 U.S. Coast Guard and Navy operations, which covered more than 250,000 square miles of ocean without locating the Electra, exposed critical gaps in radio communication standards and fuel reserve requirements for long-distance flights. Post-war reviews by the Civil Aeronautics Authority cited the Earhart case when mandating stricter position reporting intervals and minimum fuel margins for overwater operations. These procedural reforms, implemented in the late 1930s and early 1940s, directly influenced the development of the International Civil Aviation Organization standards after 1944. While the precise contribution of any single incident can be difficult to isolate, archival records confirm that the scale and public attention of the Earhart search prompted agencies to formalize coordinated multi-service responses that remain in use today. Technological efforts to resolve the case continue with tools unavailable in 1937. Recent expeditions by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery have employed high-resolution sonar and autonomous underwater vehicles to survey the seafloor near Nikumaroro, formerly Gardner Island. In 2019, an expedition recovered an aluminum fragment whose metallurgical composition matched the specifications of the Lockheed Electra's skin panels, though researchers emphasize that further analysis is required before any conclusive attribution. Parallel work by the National Geographic Society and independent researchers has applied advanced satellite imagery and LiDAR mapping to re-examine possible landing sites. These efforts operate within the realm of empirical investigation rather than speculation, yet they underscore the persistent gap between available evidence and definitive proof. The enduring fascination with Earhart's disappearance reveals much about human responses to unresolved narratives. Psychological studies on mystery and closure, including work published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, indicate that incomplete stories activate sustained cognitive engagement as the mind seeks resolution. Earhart's case satisfies several of these conditions: a celebrated public figure, a high-stakes endeavor, and an abrupt absence of physical remains. Historians note that this pattern appears across other famous disappearances, from the Franklin expedition to modern aviation incidents, suggesting the appeal lies less in any single theory than in the human impulse to impose order on uncertainty. The distinction between established fact and theoretical speculation becomes especially important here, as public discourse often blends verified radio logs and wreckage analyses with unconfirmed eyewitness accounts. The search for answers continues to matter because it connects directly to broader themes of exploration and acceptable risk. Earhart's own writings, including her 1937 book Last Flight, articulate a deliberate acceptance of danger in service of advancing aeronautical knowledge. In one passage, she observed that the most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity. That decision, weighed against the navigational and mechanical limitations of the era, illustrates the calculated trade-offs that still characterize polar, deep-sea, and space exploration. Modern risk assessment frameworks used by NASA and commercial spaceflight operators reference historical overwater flights as case studies in contingency planning, demonstrating how Earhart's flight informs current safety margins even as the precise circumstances of her loss remain unknown. Beyond the disappearance, Earhart's legacy centers on the tangible expansion of opportunity she helped create. Flight schools and scholarship programs established in her name have trained generations of pilots, while archival collections of her letters and flight logs provide primary source material for researchers studying gender dynamics in early aviation. Her public advocacy for equal access to technical fields prefigured later policy debates, and contemporary biographies grounded in her preserved correspondence continue to document these contributions without relying on conjecture about her final hours. The ongoing examination of her story therefore serves not only to close a historical gap, but also to affirm the value of persistence in both scientific inquiry and the pursuit of individual ambition. In this section of our documentary on the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, we examine the role of media, mythology, and public memory in shaping how her story has been told and retold across nearly 9 decades. Comment where you are in the world and what time you're seeing this. From the moment radio bulletins announced that Earhart and Noonan had failed to arrive at Howland Island on July 2, 1937, the mechanisms of modern mass media began transforming a tragic aviation incident into something larger than a single lost flight. Newspapers across the United States and Europe devoted front-page coverage to the search for days, then weeks, with the New York Times running daily dispatches from correspondents aboard naval vessels and at Coast Guard stations. This sustained attention was not accidental. Earhart had cultivated media relationships throughout her career, and her publisher husband George Putnam maintained close contact with wire services and radio networks during the world flight attempt. The infrastructure of celebrity that had amplified her earlier achievements now channeled public grief and uncertainty into an ongoing narrative that demanded resolution. When resolution did not come, the story did not dissolve. Instead, it calcified into myth, acquiring new layers of interpretation with each passing decade, while the factual core remained unchanged. The immediate post-war period witnessed the first major reinterpretation of Earhart's fate. Returning servicemen brought back stories from across the Pacific, and publishers eager to capitalize on public interest in the recently concluded conflict found in the Earhart mystery a ready vessel for broader anxieties about Japanese imperialism and American vulnerability in the pre-war years. Books and magazine articles written between 1945 and 1960 frequently framed the disappearance as evidence of sinister foreign intervention, a narrative that resonated with readers conditioned by years of wartime propaganda. These accounts often rested on the testimony of veterans who had passed through islands where Earhart's name had become local legend, yet the stories were rarely subjected to the evidentiary standards that professional historians applied to other wartime claims. The result was a body of literature that blurred the boundary between oral history and documented fact, establishing patterns of interpretation that would persist for generations. Television altered the dynamic further beginning in the 1960s. The medium's appetite for compelling visual narratives made Earhart's story ideal material. Yet the constraints of broadcast journalism created pressure to resolve the mystery within a single program, rather than to convey the genuine uncertainty preserved in archival records. Documentaries produced during this era typically presented one theory as more credible than others, then ended with confident statements about what probably happened. Viewers received the impression of authoritative conclusions from investigations that had in practice produced only competing hypotheses. This structural feature of broadcast storytelling contributed to what historians of science communication have called the false resolution problem, where public understanding of an unresolved question calcifies around a single explanation while the underlying evidence remains inconclusive. Earhart's disappearance proved especially susceptible to this dynamic because the factual record is genuine and verifiable in its early stages, lending credibility to the portions of any documentary that then shade into speculation. The internet era has accelerated this pattern while simultaneously enabling more rigorous counter-investigation. Online archives have made primary source documents accessible to researchers without institutional affiliations, allowing amateur historians to examine declassified Navy logs, British colonial records, and Coast Guard radio transcripts that previously required travel to Washington, London, or Fiji. This democratization of archival access has produced genuine contributions, including independent analyses of radio propagation models and metallurgical databases that have informed TIHAR's artifact comparisons.